Hey there, welcome back to True Crime Records. Tonight, we step away from a single man and into something far larger. An empire that does not collapse when one leader falls. A machine that does not pause when the world looks directly at it. A syndicate so vast, so patient, so deeply embedded into the fabric of power that many believe it is not just the most powerful cartel in Mexico, but the most powerful criminal syndicate on earth. The Sinaloa Cartel. To the public, it exists in headlines and courtrooms. To the outside world, it seems like a violent organization built on fear and profit. But behind the noise, behind the arrests, behind the spectacle, is something far more dangerous. A system that learned how to survive generations. A structure that learned how to disappear without ever leaving. An organization that learned how to replace leaders the way a body replaces cells. Tonight, we will trace how this cartel was born, how it outlived every war meant to destroy it, how it evolved faster than the governments chasing it, and how it became a power that doesn't need to announce itself to be obeyed. Before we begin, take a quiet moment and let me know in the comments. Which country are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Now settle in, let the world slow down, and follow me into the anatomy of an empire that learned how to survive everything. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. A new story is waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Mountains That Created an Empire. Long before the world knew the name Sinaloa, the land already understood what it was preparing to become. The western mountains of Mexico rise slowly, like the memory of something ancient. Their valleys are narrow, their roads uncertain, their shadows long. In these mountains, the terrain does not merely hide movement. It teaches it. This is where the root of the Sinaloa Cartel began. Not as an organization, not as a network, not even as a criminal idea, but as survival. In the early decades, these mountains produced one thing in abundance: silence. Families lived far from the reach of institutions. Towns were separated by dirt roads that could disappear after a single storm. Opportunity did not arrive through education, industry, or government protection. It arrived through movement, through carrying, through escorting, through knowing which trails existed, and which ones only seemed to exist until you needed them. This stage, no one spoke of cartels. There were only routes. Routes that moved contraband. Routes that moved money. Routes that moved power before anyone ever gave it that name. What made this region different from so many others in the world was not the presence of crime. Crime exists everywhere. What made it different was adaptation. The people of these mountains learned early that visibility brought interference, and interference brought extinction. So they learned how to stay unseen, how to move without rhythm, how to trade without record, how to enforce without witnesses. Over time, this silence hardened into culture. Children learned what adults would not explain. Names were carried in whispers instead of documents. Trust was measured by consistency, not conversation. This is how criminal ecosystems are born long before criminal organizations exist. By the time international demand entered the equation, the mountains were already ready. The pathways already mapped, the silence already perfected, the discipline already ingrained. All that was missing was scale. The first generations who transformed isolated smuggling into coordinated trafficking did not imagine empires. They imagined continuity. They did not seek to dominate cities. They sought to avoid attention. What would later become the Sinaloa Cartel was not founded through a declaration. It condensed. Small corridors began sharing protection. Independent operators began aligning schedules. Trust slowly replaced isolation. This alignment was not idealistic. It was mathematical. Sharing risk reduces exposure. Pooling protection increases survival. And survival is the oldest business model in the underworld. As global demand increased, the routes expanded outward like veins from a heart that had existed long before the body around it was recognized. Land corridors met maritime pathways. Air transport joined ground movement. Borders that once seemed distant became just another stage in the same quiet transaction. What outsiders could not see at this time was that a network was already forming, not in public, not in hierarchy, but in memory and habit, and memory, once shared across enough people, becomes structure. One of the strangest features of what would later become the Sinaloa Cartel is that it never depended on a single ideology, IT was not born from politics. IT was not born from rebellion. IT was not born from religion. IT was born from function. How do you move things unseen? How do you protect routes without inviting war? How do you replace loss without collapsing the system? Every solved problem became a lesson. Every lesson became inherited knowledge. This is why the Sinaloa structure would later feel so different from other organizations. That IT was not purely violent. That IT was not purely financial. IT was organizational evolution moving at human speed. By the time future leaders entered this world, the paths were already prepared for them. They did not need to invent the system. They only needed to inhabit it. As decades passed, something critical occurred. The system learned how to absorb disruption. Where other trafficking groups collapsed when leaders fell, Sinaloa learned how to fragment and recombine. Where others fought for public dominance, Sinaloa learned how to let competitors attract attention while it remained diffuse. This adaptability became its most dangerous weapon. Not guns, not fear, not even money, but the ability to survive its own losses without transforming them into weakness. It did not depend on any single family. It did not depend on any single city. It did not depend on any single leader. It depended on redundancy. And redundancy is what makes systems immortal. By the time the world formally recognized the Sinaloa Cartel as a dominant force, it had already existed in functional form for generations. What law enforcement saw as emergence was actually exposure. By then, the cartel was no longer a secret, but it was already too deep to be uprooted cleanly. The mountains that once hid single couriers now protected international logistics. The silence that once shielded villages now shielded international finance. And the habits once learned for survival had matured into a global criminal philosophy. This is the foundation that everything else will rise from. Not chaos, not spectacle, but mountain silence scaled into world power. Chapter 2. The First Bloodlines. Before the world ever spoke the name Sinaloa Cartel with fear, it whispered something else instead. Family. Not in the sense the world imagines it. Not warmth, not safety, not shared comfort, but lineage. Inheritance. Continuity passed through blood and obligation rather than law. The earliest structure of the cartel was not built through corporate hierarchy. It was built through bloodlines that stretched across generations of survival inside the same mountains. Fathers taught sons where not to walk. Mothers taught daughters which names could travel safely through conversation. Uncles carried the stories of disappeared men as quiet warnings rather than tragedies. Power did not announce itself through violence at first. It announced itself through who was still standing when others were not. In these mountains, longevity was reputation. And reputation was the only currency that mattered. The first families who shaped the deep structure of Sinaloa did not seek public control. Their power came from something far more durable. They controlled the trails between valleys, the safe houses embedded into ordinary villages, the maritime contacts along the western coast, the agricultural cover that explained constant movement, and most importantly, the trust networks necessary to move anything unseen, unlike other criminal groups that would later rise through rapid violence. Sinaloa's early architects learned that violence drew memory, memory drew enforcement, and enforcement drew extinction. They learned restraint instead, discipline instead, time instead. Their influence grew slowly, the way roots grow beneath stone, unseen, unchallenged, unstoppable once mature. What made these bloodlines stronger than rivals was not just cohesion. It was redundancy. No route belonged to one family alone. No shipment relied on one corridor. No decision flowed through a single voice. Everything overlapped. Everything duplicated. If one line broke, another absorbed the pressure without public disruption. This is the earliest version of Sinaloa's design philosophy. Not domination, absorption. The ability to take impact without revealing where it landed. As global demand increased, the families did something that would later define Sinaloa's supremacy. They cooperated instead of competing. Other regions fractured into war. Sinaloa aligned. Other networks fought for visibility. Sinaloa disappeared deeper. Other groups chased terror. Sinaloa chased logistics. This cooperation did not require meetings. It required only shared memory of what chaos did to families. Peace was not moral. It was profitable. By the time modern law enforcement would later define Sinaloa as a centralized cartel, it was already something else entirely. It was a federation of bloodlines, each family autonomous, each family armed, each family intertwined through mutual economic dependence. No single betrayal could collapse the whole. No single capture could remove the structure. This design did not make Sinaloa loud. It made it eternal. Outside the mountains, the world began to change. Borders hardened, demand expanded, technology accelerated movement, and slowly, the Bloodline Federation realized something dangerous. The old routes were no longer enough. The mountains had created them, but the world was now calling them outward. The transition from regional power to international syndicate did not occur through declaration. It occurred through adaptation. Pressure. Airports replaced dirt roads. Shipping containers replaced caravans. Banking systems replaced buried currency. And once again, Sinaloa adapted faster than its enemies. Because adaptation was already embedded into its blood, this chapter of the cartel's growth did not feature wars. It featured infrastructure being born quietly. And the families at the center of that growth did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as caretakers of continuity. Their job was not conquest. Their job was that the system survived them, that their children would inherit structure instead of ashes. This is how the Sinaloa Cartel became something no task force could fully map. Not an organization, not a gang, not even an empire. It became a generational organism. Point one that learned to breathe through families the same way lungs breathe through AI. By the end of this phase, the foundation was complete. The trails were international. The families were unified. The redundancy was perfected. The silence was absolute. And now, the syndicate was ready for the era where leaders would emerge, not as kings, but as operators of a machine already older than their own fame. Chapter 3. Leadership Without Thrones. The world expects empires to crown kings. The Sinaloa Cartel never fully did. From the beginning, it rejected the idea that one voice should carry the full weight of power. Not because leadership was weak, but because visible leadership creates a visible target. In Sinaloa, power learned how to move without being seen. The earliest leaders did not sit on stages. They did not issue grand commands. They did not seek admiration. Their authority was not built through fear displayed in public. It was built through permission granted in private. You were powerful not because you declared yourself so, but because routes opened when you asked, because protection arrived when you moved, because silence followed your decisions without explanation. That is how authority formed here, embedded, unspoken, rarely challenged. Other cartels built pyramids. Sinaloa built layers. Each layer believed it was acting with independence, yet each layer unknowingly served the same deeper balance. When one operator fell, another quietly absorbed his corridors. When one family weakened, another extended cover without making it visible. This created an illusion of decentralization. But beneath it was something stronger than hierarchy. It was alignment. They did not need formal meetings to coordinate direction. The flow of money, movement, and protection naturally pointed everyone toward the same outcome: continuity. This meant leadership was not a position. It was a function, and functions can be replaced. The men who rose inside this structure did not rise because they were the most violent. They rose because they were the most predictable under pressure. Predictability keeps systems stable. Instability invites war. Those who could move product without attracting conflict gained trust. Those who could resolve disputes without blood gained reach. Those who understood timing became untouchable. Sinaloa rewarded operators, not tyrants. The outside world misunderstood this. They believed leadership meant command. Inside Sinaloa, leadership meant load-bearing silence. Another rule governed elevation inside the cartel. No one advanced alone. Every rising figure required family alignment, route integrity, financial discipline, and most importantly, invisible consensus. If enough quiet approvals didn't form around you, you never reached the next level, no matter how dangerous you were, no matter how feared. This prevented sudden coups. It prevented chaos. It prevented the emotional volatility that destroyed so many other criminal organizations. Ambition was allowed, but recklessness was filtered out. This structure created something rare in the criminal world: leadership longevity. Other cartels burned through kings every few years. Sinaloa allowed its figures to mature into institutions. Years passed without radical shifts. Routes stabilized instead of fragmenting. Trust deepened. Instead of shattering, by the time international authorities began constructing profiles of cartel leadership, they could not understand why Sinaloa did not fracture the way others did. The answer was simple. There was no throne to overthrow. Internally, this created a strange psychological environment. Men with immense power lived as if they were middle managers. There were no crowns in royal courts in visible empires. Only constant movement. Only constant accounting. Only constant risk carried under. Calm expression. This produced leaders who did not feel like rulers. They felt like caretakers of momentum. And caretakers do not rule. They maintain. Leadership inside Sinaloa was not about domination. It was about preserving flow. Flow of money. Flow of movement. Flow of silence. And whenever that flow was threatened, leadership intervened, not with speeches, but with redirection. Routes changed. Contacts shifted. Protection rebalanced. Problems vanished without public explanation. This created the image of an organization that seemed immune to disruption, not because it resisted pressure violently, but because it rearranged itself faster than pressure could focus. By the end of this phase in its evolution, Sinaloa had achieved something no cartel before it ever fully had. It had institutionalized leadership, not as identity, not as title, but as distributed responsibility. Any man could fall, the machine would not. And it was this exact architectural philosophy, leadership without thrones, that would later allow the cartel to survive what no analysts believed survival was possible from: war, betrayal, global pursuit, even the removal of its most famous figures, because Sinaloa had never been built to depend on anyone who could be singled out. Not from the very beginning, not from the mountains. Chapter 4. The First Cartel War, where silence learned how to kill. The first true war did not begin with explosions. It began with pressure. Pressure on routes, pressure on ports, pressure on families who had never before been forced to choose sides. For years, the Sinaloa Cartel had expanded without drawing attention to itself. While other groups fought openly for territory, Sinaloa moved like water around stone, avoiding confrontation, absorbing opportunity, never revealing the full map of its reach. But war does not always arrive because it is invited. Sometimes it arrives because growth becomes impossible to ignore. As international demand surged, rival organizations realized something unsettling. Entire corridors were being used without their permission. Shipments were passing through regions once contested, yet no battles appeared. No assassinations followed. No warnings were issued. Territory was being taken without being taken. This unnerved older groups whose power depended on fear and visible enforcement that to them. Silence looked like weakness. They were wrong. The first open challenges came not from the mountains, but from the lowlands and border regions, where trafficking routes intersected with political influence, urban enforcement, and rapidly shifting loyalties. Smaller factions tried to intercept Sinaloa shipments, first quietly, then through intimidation, then through open violence. They expected retaliation. They expected war like the wars they had always known. Instead, nothing happened. For weeks, shipments simply rerouted. Contacts disappeared. Protection realigned. Sinaloa did not strike back immediately. It withdrew just enough to reveal everyone who had interfered. Only when the full list of aggressors was visible did the response begin. The counter-movement did not look like war. There were no mass executions no public massacres. No announcements. Instead, very specific people simply stopped moving. A transporter vanished on a highway and was never recovered. A port supervisor lost his position overnight without explanation. A customs intermediary fled his home without telling his family why. Each disappearance created confusion. Confusion created fear. Fear spread not through bodies, but through uncertainty. This was Sinaloa's first lesson to its rivals. You will not know when the strike is coming, and you will not know who created it. Other cartels fought wars with spectacle because spectacle builds reputation. Sinaloa fought with disruption of infrastructure. Routes collapsed without warning. Money corridors dried overnight. Protection evaporated at critical moments. Rivals could not unify against the threat because the threat never presented itself as a single enemy. It felt like the environment itself had turned hostile. This forced a dangerous realization across the criminal landscape. You could not fight Sinaloa as a faction, you had to fight it as a system. And systems are far harder to defeat than MEN.AS. Smaller groups collapsed under invisible pressure. Larger organizations were forced to intervene. Now the war elevated from regional conflict to structural confrontation. Suddenly, alliances formed. Border territories split into zones of influence. Entire cities became chessboards for men who never appeared on them. This was the first time Sinaloa was forced to defend its expansion openly, and the first time the world mistook its response for weakness because its violence did not announce itself. Inside Sinaloa, the response was not emotional. It was organizational. Leadership did not issue revenge orders. They issued continuity commands. Preserve routes. Protect families. Suffocate interference. Violence was permitted only when it served structure, never image. This discipline spared them from the kind of bloodshed that later destroyed other cartels, but it did not spare them from conflict. Deaths still occurred. They were simply unseen by design. As the months passed, rival groups began losing ground without understanding where the losses were coming from. Meetings failed to materialize because messengers disappeared. Shipments failed because drivers never arrived. Payoffs failed because intermediaries stopped answering. Trust began to collapse between allied factions. Every failure looked like betrayal. Every betrayal triggered infighting. Sinaloa did not need to defeat its rivals directly. It only needed to accelerate their internal collapse. This was the true nature of the first cartel war. Not a battle for territory, but a battle for organizational coherence. The group that could maintain internal rhythm would survive. The group that fractured would disappear. By the end of the first major conflict cycle, several competing factions were either absorbed, dismantled, or forced into permanent defensive posture. Sinaloa emerged without announcing victory, but everyone understood what had changed. The criminal world learned a new rule. You could survive violence. You could survive arrest. You could even survive betrayal, but you could not survive losing your system, and Sinaloa had just proven that it could destroy systems without ever declaring war on them. From that moment forward, fear surrounding the organization shifted shape. It was no longer fear of visible retaliation. It became fear of becoming irrelevant without knowing why. Routes failing silently. Money evaporating. Protection dissolving. This is the kind of fear that does not produce resistance. It produces submission without negotiation. By the time authorities began noticing increased instability among rival groups, the damage had already been done. The war had ended, not with a decisive battle, but with a redistribution of power so quiet that it felt natural. Sinaloa emerged not as a conquering force, but as the only structure left standing that still functioned the way criminal systems are meant to function. And this victory would change everything. Because now the organization did not just control routes, it controlled expectations, it controlled how long conflicts could last, it controlled how silence itself could be weaponized. The first cartel war taught Sinaloa its most dangerous lesson yet. You do not need to win loudly if you can make everyone else lose quietly. Chapter 5. The Rise of Transnational Power. The mountains were no longer enough. For generations, the Western Highlands had protected the silence of the Sinaloa Cartel. They had hidden trails, erased footprints, and taught entire bloodlines how to move without being seen. But demand does not respect geography. Demand speaks across oceans. By the time Sinaloa mastered the art of silent regional control, the world beyond Mexico had already shifted into a new phase of consumption. What had once been a domestic flow transformed into a continental appetite. Then an international one. And with that transformation came a dangerous realization. If Sinaloa remained only a mountain-based power, it would eventually be surrounded, contained, and replaced by organizations willing to risk visibility for global domination. And so the cartel faced its most important evolutionary pressure yet. Not whether it could survive, but whether it could scale without becoming visible. The decision to expand beyond Mexico did not come from ambition. It came from containment. Avoidance. Routes that remain fixed become predictable. Predictability attracts surveillance. Surveillance attracts seizure. and seizure tracks collapsed. So Sinaloa did what it had always done best. It diversified invisible pathways. Land routes spread northward through multiple border points at once, ensuring that no single chokehold could ever truly close the system. Maritime corridors multiplied along the Pacific coast, embedding shipments into fishing fleets, shipping logistics, and commercial cargo that could not be searched fast enough to stop the flow. Air transport entered the equation not through public airports alone, but through isolated landing zones, improvised strips, and repurposed agricultural paths that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. At this stage, the cartel did something revolutionary for its time. It stopped thinking like a smuggling organization and began thinking like a logistics corporation that feared exposure. With international movement came a new kind of vulnerability. The people who operated foreign ports, airports, and corridors did not share Sinaloa's generational silence culture. They were not born into bloodlines trained for invisibility. They were businessmen, dock workers, customs agents, transport managers, freight inspectors, and these people did not move in silence. They moved in systems, which meant Sinaloa could no longer rely only on fear, loyalty, or tradition. It now had to master finance, documentation, legal structure, corporate shields, and international bureaucracy. This was the moment when the cartel's evolution accelerated beyond anything law enforcement originally expected. Shell companies began appearing in clusters, export firms, fishing operations, produce distributors, construction suppliers, shipping intermediaries. None of them appeared unusual on their own, but together they formed something entirely new, a parallel commercial skeleton that moved real goods alongside invisible ones. This allowed the organization to hide illicit flow inside legitimate volume, not through concealment alone, but through overload. When everything is moving, nothing stands out. Money, once buried or hand-delivered, now flowed through layered banking routes, currency exchange operations, investment vehicles, property development, offshore accounts. The cartel did not need to launder money the way earlier organizations had. It absorbed criminal revenue into commercial ecosystems so large they no longer appeared criminal at all. This allowed an unprecedented level of insulation. When seizures happened, they did not trigger collapse. When accounts were frozen, they did not halt movement. There was always another corridor quietly absorbing the pressure. This transformation marked the moment Sinaloa stopped being a regional trafficking federation and became a transnational economic organism. It no longer depended on any single country. It no longer depended on any single port. It no longer depended on any single border. It lived in the spaces between jurisdictions, and jurisdictions, by nature, do not align smoothly. With this expansion came a new form of protection, not gunmen, not convoys, but economic entanglement. Entire communities abroad now depended on industries that unknowingly overlapped with Sinaloa's corridors. Shipping jobs, logistics contracts, construction financing, real estate markets. This created a condition more powerful than fear. It created hesitation. Disruption no longer harmed only criminals. It harmed supply chains, jobs, regional economies. And when disruption creates collateral damage, political resistance follows. This gave the cartel an invisible diplomatic shield, not through corruption alone, but through economic dependency. At this stage, Sinaloa no longer appeared as a cartel everywhere it operated. In many regions, it appeared simply as a trading partner, an employer, a logistics provider, a financier. Its criminal identity dissolved into context, and context is far harder to prosecute than action. What made this expansion so dangerous was not the volume of product. It was the normalization of its movement through legitimate systems. Sinaloa did not force the world to accept it. It allowed the world to adapt around it. And once the world adapts to you, you no longer appear as a threat. You appear as infrastructure. This was the moment global authorities unknowingly crossed a point of no return. They were no longer dealing with smugglers. They were dealing with a distributed multinational shadow economy that operated beneath legal trade without interrupting it. To remove it, they would now have to disrupt systems that entire regions depended on, and systems do not fall cleanly. By the end of this phase, Sinaloa's routes no longer looked like lines on a map. They looked like webs woven between economies, from mountain villages to international ports, from dirt trails to shipping manifests, from whispered names to printed invoices. The machine had learned how to wear the disguise of legitimacy, and that disguise would protect it longer than any army ever could. Once the Sinaloa Cartel crossed into true transnational territory, everything changed, not in noise, but in complexity. Regional dominance is about territory. Global dominance is about flow, and flow is governed by systems far larger than any single criminal organization. Ports operate on schedules measured in seconds. Shipping vessels follow algorithms, not instinct. Customs inspections rely on probability, not certainty. Financial clearing systems move faster than human review. To survive inside this environment, Sinaloa had to do more than hide. It had to synchronize with the pace of the modern world. The first vulnerability they confronted was speed. In the mountains, time bends. Etc. Time accelerates. Inside financial networks, time fragments into milliseconds. A system built on generational patience now had to operate at machine rhythm without losing its identity. So the organization did something remarkable. It mirrored the mechanics of global trade. Instead of forcing shipments into commercial channels, it allowed commercial channels to pull shipments naturally through their own gravity. Freight contracts became shields. Insured cargo became camouflage. Routine inspections became obstacles that were already priced into the cost of doing business. By the time authorities targeted one channel, 10 more had already absorbed its volume. This was not expansion through aggression. It was expansion through osmosis. With this came a radical shift in personnel. Not everyone inside the organization carried weapons anymore. Some carried spreadsheets. Some carried ledger books. Some managed shipping schedules. Some oversaw currency exchange fluctuations across continents. These individuals did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as operators inside a shadow supply chain. And the more professional this layer became, the more insulated the upper structure grew, because professionals do not panic. They calculate. But this expansion also introduced a new danger: distance. The farther the operation spread from the original bloodlines of Sinaloa, the weaker traditional loyalty became. Foreign partners did not share ancestral memory. They shared contracts. And contracts can be broken. This forced the cartel into its most delicate balancing act yet. How do you enforce discipline across oceans without becoming visible? The answer was not more violence. It was selective consequence. Instead of widespread retaliation, Sinaloa began using targeted disruption as behavioral correction. That a logistics partner who violated terms did not disappear publicly. His contracts disappeared, his shipping lanes closed, his access to finance evaporated. The message spread faster than gunfire ever could. If you betray the flow will leave you. No martyrs were created. Only caution. As the organization extended across multiple continents, it also learned how to operate inside competing legal systems simultaneously. What was illegal in one jurisdiction was tolerated in another. What was scrutinized in one port was routine in another. What was flagged in one country was ignored in the next. This fragmentation of global law became the cartel's greatest insulation layer. Because enforcement agencies are bound by borders, supply chains are not. Sinaloa learned to move along these seams, where warrants could not follow, where extradition stalled, where intelligence stalled in translation between languages and legal codes. It did not defeat governments. It simply outpaced their alignment. Another transformation quietly unfolded in the psychology of fear. In earlier years, fear lived locally. In a village. In a neighborhood, along a single highway. Now fear became abstract. Shipping companies did not know which contract was dangerous. Banks did not know which client was compromised. Governments did not know which seizures would destabilize markets rather than criminals. Fear detached from faces and attached to uncertainty itself. And uncertainty is far more controllable than terror. Terror provokes reaction. Uncertainty produces delay. Delay buys time. And time, in logistics, is profit. As the cartel embedded into international trade, it also quietly shaped migration patterns, labor flows, and regional infrastructure development. Truck routes expanded where transport hubs emerged. Warehousing districts grew near ports that needed them. Entire commercial zones developed without knowing what hidden current had shaped their location. To the public, This looked like economic growth. In reality, it was economic growth guided quietly by invisible movement. This is how criminal power learns to hide inside prosperity. When prosperity increases, suspicion decreases. Its most advanced stage, the cartel no longer asked how to move product across borders. It asked, which border will be overwhelmed enough next year that our movement becomes statistical noise instead of anomaly? Which port is expanding capacity so fast that oversight thins by default? Which industry will grow so quickly that financial irregularities become indistinguishable from speculative volatility? The organization was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. It moved where the world was going, not where it had been. And yet, with all this sophistication, one vulnerability remained constant. The further the operation extended from its mountainous origin, the more it depended on translation. Translation of language, translation of law, translation of loyalty. Each layer of translation introduced delay. Each delay introduced exposure. And exposure, no matter how small, always accumulates somewhere. By the midpoint of its transnational expansion, Sinaloa had achieved something unprecedented. It no longer appeared to be chasing demand. Demand appeared to be chasing it. Markets adapted to its rhythm. Distribution networks synchronized to its pace. Consumers downstream never touched the organization, yet lived inside patterns it shaped. This is the invisible apex of transnational criminal power, not visibility, not headlines, but silent alignment between illegal movement and legal infrastructure. And still, beneath all of this complexity, the same mountain logic endured: silence, redundancy, adaptation. Time. The tools had changed, the scale had exploded, but the philosophy remained untouched. The world had grown louder. Sinaloa had simply grown wider. At full transnational scale, the Sinaloa Cartel no longer measured success by territory. It measured success by continuity without disruption. Borders were no longer obstacles. They became filters. Ports were no longer entry points. They became blending zones where legal and illegal motion overlapped so thoroughly that separation itself grew difficult to define. At this level, the organization did not feel like a cartel, even to those moving inside its reach. It felt like a current. And currents do not announce themselves. They are detected only by what they move. What made Sinaloa's transnational phase so difficult to counter was that its violence declined while its leverage multiplied. Earlier criminal organizations relied on terror to control territory. Terror is loud. Terror attracts response. Terror produces enemies who remember. Sinaloa learned something colder. That removal of opportunity is far more effective than removal of life. When a competing corridor stopped functioning, no bodies were required to prove what had happened. Entire markets would simply shift away from that route. Insurance costs would rise. Transport risk would compound. Financial partners would quietly withdraw. The corridor would die not by explosion, but by economic asphyxiation. This created a strange new psychology of submission. Rivals were no longer afraid of being killed. They were afraid of becoming unviable, and unviable operators do not inspire loyalty. They collapse alone. At the height of this expansion, Sinaloa had quietly achieved something no criminal organization had fully accomplished before. It had learned how to convert risk into background noise. Seizures still happened. Arrests still appeared. Shipments still vanished. But none of it produced collapse or even serious instability. Every loss had already been mathematically absorbed somewhere else in the system before it occurred. The machine was no longer surviving disruptions. It was expecting them. This anticipation created a profound strategic asymmetry. Authorities reacted to events. Sinaloa reacted to probabilities. Where enforcement moved based on what had already happened, the cartel moved based on what was statistically likely to happen next. Time itself became divided between two logics: the past, which the state chased; the future, which the organization occupied. At this scale, the border between criminal and non-criminal participation grew increasingly blurred. Drivers did not know what they carried. Warehouse managers did not know what passed through. Shipping clerks did not know what layers of ownership sat above their contracts. Yet each played a role, not through intention, through position. This removed morality from the question of participation altogether. People were no longer choosing between good and evil. They were choosing between employment and unemployment, efficiency and poverty, silence and displacement. This is the most advanced form of criminal integration, when crime no longer needs belief to function, only motion. Ironically, this level of sophistication also created the condition for the cartel's greatest vulnerability: scale attracts. Analysis. When small organizations grow large enough to shape markets, they begin to leave patterns too wide to fully erase. Statistical modeling grows more accurate than informants. Trade anomalies become more informative than confessions. Financial irregularities reveal corridors long before spies ever could. The larger Sinaloa grew, the more it became visible not as a criminal group, but as a shadow distortion inside global commerce itself. And distortions, once detected, do not disappear easily. They can be shifted, but not erased. Still, during this era, the organization stood at its most dominant. It had achieved global corridors: financial insulation, operational redundancy, political hesitation, economic entanglement, psychological deterrence, all without declaring itself as the central authority of anything. The world bent not because it was commanded, but because movement had already aligned around the efficiencies Sinaloa created. When a system becomes the most efficient carrier of motion inside an environment, it no longer competes. It becomes default. Yet beneath the shine of global power, an ancient truth remained quietly present, and no matter how wide a system spreads, it still depends on human decision at its core. And human decision always creates friction. Ambition appears, ego emerges, fear miscalculates, trust breaks. Somewhere inside every giant structure, a moment of misalignment eventually forms, not because systems are weak, but because humans are variable. The end of this era approached, that misalignment began quietly multiplying. New rivals tested boundaries not with violence, but with scale. Foreign partners began retaining more leverage. Independent traffickers learned enough from Sinaloa's model to replicate pieces of it for themselves. The mountain philosophy was now being copied, and for the first time, Sinaloa was no longer the only organization that understood how to merge invisibility with international trade. The monopoly of method was ending. This is the paradox of perfect evolution. When a system becomes too successful, its logic spreads beyond its control. And once everyone learns your language, your advantage becomes shared. By the end of its pure transnational ascent, the Sinaloa Cartel no longer needed to prove its power. The world already moved as if that power were assumed. But power that no longer needs to prove itself always reaches a dangerous stage. The stage where internal gravity becomes more dangerous than external force, because collapse, when it finally comes to systems like this, does not arrive from the outside. It comes from pressure that forms silently, deep inside the machine itself. Chapter 6. Narcopolitics. When power learned how to wear a suit. By the time the Sinaloa Cartel reached its full transnational stride, violence was no longer its primary language. Its new language was access. Access to permits. Access to infrastructure. Access to immunity disguised as bureaucracy. This was the moment criminal power began wearing paperwork instead of weapons, and it changed everything. In the early years, protection had come from isolation. In the cartel wars, protection had come from silence. Now, at global scale, protection would come from administration, because administration decides which inspections happen, which records are reviewed, which shipments are delayed, which investigations receive funding, which disappear into paperwork. To control administration is to control tempo, and tempo determines what is noticed and what is forgotten. The first political relationships were not built through ideology. They were built through problem solving. A mayor needed roads repaired faster than budgets allowed. A police chief needed equipment that procurement couldn't deliver in time. A regional official needed public projects completed before election season. Money moved faster than paperwork. Money did not require committees. Money did not wait for votes. And so the cartel began solving delays the state could not. This created a dangerous dependency, not of belief, of functionality. At this stage, corruption did not look like envelopes passed in dark corridors. It looked like campaign donations, infrastructure contracts, construction, partnerships, security outsourcing, transportation agreements, all legal on the surface, all lethal in consequence. The organization did not buy loyalty. It replaced inefficiency. And efficiency is the most difficult form of power to remove once people grow accustomed to it. Local enforcement units slowly transformed in behavior, not because every officer was compromised, but because command decisions began shifting, patrol schedules changed, inspection priorities shifted, response times altered, jurisdictional disputes delayed action. No single action proved corruption, but together they created predictable breathing space for movement. The cartel did not need to paralyze government. It only needed to slow it selectively. What made this phase uniquely powerful was that it created a layer of deniability around criminal control. A seized shipment could be explained as a success. A failed investigation could be blamed on budget. A missing witness could be attributed to relocation. Every disruption could be reframed as routine dysfunction instead of systemic compromise. And routine dysfunction is something no population is ever surprised by. As influence deepened, the organization learned to operate across electoral cycles. Power was no longer attached to individuals alone. It was attached to offices. When one official lost influence, another quietly filled the same channel. Relationships transferred with positions. Corruption became embedded not inside people, but inside procedures. This transformed how protection functioned psychologically. Before, protection felt like fear. Now, protection felt like normality. Things simply continued to work. Paperwork progressed faster in some places than in others. Approvals arrived when others stalled. Permits appeared without difficulty. Checks never arrived unexpectedly. This is the most advanced camouflage crime can wear. The disguise of functionality at the same time. The organization learned to divide enforcement rather than confront it. Federal agencies blamed state agencies. State agencies blamed municipalities. Municipal governments blamed national budgets. Jurisdiction disputes grew. Information stalled between offices. No single authority ever saw enough pieces to confirm the whole. This fragmented vision created fertile ground for plausible ignorance, and plausible ignorance protects everyone involved. During this period, the cartel did not seek to overthrow government. It sought something more durable. To become indistinguishable from its background, not the state above the state, but the shadow that moves wherever the state hesitates. At community level, this altered the emotion of fear itself. People no longer feared violent intrusion. They feared administrative exclusion. Businesses that refused cooperation found their licenses delayed. Property titles stalled. Permits vanished in filing systems. Inspections suddenly arrived weekly instead of yearly. No threats were issued. No men with weapons appeared. Life simply became more difficult until compliance felt easier than resistance. This is the moment when criminal power graduates into bureaucratic pressure, a form of control far more stable than terror, because terror provokes outrage, but inconvenience provokes exhaustion. And exhausted populations do not rebel, they adapt. That be why the end of this phase. The Sinaloa Cartel no longer needed to fear law enforcement as an external enemy. Law enforcement had become one of its environments, not owned, not defeated, but reshaped through delay, permission, and selective blindness. Yet this success planted the seed of its future vulnerability, because once power enters politics, it leaves records, documents linger, budgets trace, approvals leave signatures, and signatures can be studied in ways gunfire never could. As political influence expanded, a subtle transformation took place within the machinery of authority. It was not hostile. It was procedural. Budgets began flowing in strange directions. Infrastructure projects appeared where demand had once been thin. Security resources gathered in places where crime suddenly seemed to fade, at least on the surface. Nothing about it looked criminal. Everything about it looked administrative. This is how criminal power passes the final test of visibility. It stops looking like crime at all. The new battlefield was no longer streets and highways. It was procurement offices, zoning boards, public tenders, federal task allocations, audit committees, licensing departments. In these rooms, voices mattered more than weapons, tone mattered more than threats, and timing mattered more than force. Decisions were not conquered, they were channeled. This created a new archetype of participant inside the system. Not the gunman, not the courier, but the intermediary, the man who knew how to translate urgency into procedure, The woman who understood which office stalled under pressure and which bowed under paperwork. The consultant who could reroute public contracts quietly. The advisor who framed interference as inefficiency rather than investigation. These figures did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as facilitators. And facilitators are always the most dangerous kind of participant because they believe they are neutral. Corruption, at this stage, rarely took the form of direct bribery. Every transfer could be defended as legitimate. Every connection could be justified as professional. There was always a document, always a justification, always a signature that looked ordinary. This turned criminal protection into a paper shield. As this shield thickened, enforcement agencies encountered something deeply unsettling. They were no longer confronting open obstruction. They were confronting priority displacement. Investigations were not denied, they were delayed. Resources were not withdrawn, they were reallocated. Arrests were not prevented. They were made overly visible and then drowned in unrelated operations. Success was allowed, follow-through was not. This created the illusion of effort without the danger of conclusion. The organization did not stop being hunted, but the hunt slowed. And in a race between systems and logistics, slowing is often the same as losing. Inside communities, the emotional climate shifted again. People spoke less about danger. They spoke more about connections. Who could solve problems? Who knew someone in an office? Who could make delays disappear? Influence replaced fear as the organizing emotion. Parents taught children how to navigate institutions rather than how to avoid gunfire. This did not feel like victory. It felt like reorientation at higher levels of governance. A similar pattern emerged that no leader could be publicly associated with criminal protection, but many could be associated with problem solving. Roads appeared faster. Markets stabilized unexpectedly. Security presence balanced in ways that reduced conflict without raising questions. These leaders were rewarded politically, and reward reinforces method. Yet every method that works too well becomes visible in ways its creators often underestimate, because efficiency leaves tracks, and tracks attract analysts before they attract investigators. Inside financial systems, anomalies began to cluster. Project completion times shortened beyond statistical norms. Procurement cycles displayed unusual consistency. Regions that should have shown volatility appeared unnaturally stable. Stability is not inherently suspicious, but asymmetrical stability is, especially when it appears in exactly those spaces where violence once thrived. As analysts quietly studied these patterns, they began to see something broader than corruption. They saw systemic bias. Not toward one person, not toward one party, but toward continuity of a specific underground flow. This was not governance failure. It was parallel governance quietly optimizing outcomes for its own survival. At this stage, the organization had achieved something few criminal systems ever have. It no longer depended entirely on coercion. It benefited from structural incentive. People behaved in neutral ways that unknowingly benefited its corridors, not because they were ordered to, but because the system rewarded that behavior efficiently. And systems always shape behavior more reliably than threats do. This deep integration created a dangerous illusion of permanence. When a criminal network becomes embedded in bureaucracy, it begins to feel as though it has passed beyond vulnerability. It feels like it has crossed into a domain that law cannot reach without unraveling itself. And in some ways, that belief is justified, because removing deep structural corruption always produces collateral collapse. Roads stop being built. Budgets freeze. Administrative functions stall. Communities feel the impact immediately. This makes reform politically expensive, and what is expensive is often postponed. Yet another vulnerability was forming quietly. Because bureaucracy remembers, files persist, records outlive officials, budgets archive, signatures accumulate, and over long time horizons, documentation becomes more dangerous than informants ever were. The phase of narco-politics transformed criminal power from a hunter into a shadow partner of governance, not ruling from above, but influencing from within, not writing laws, but shaping how they were applied. It was subtle. It was slow. It was devastatingly effective. And still, beneath this administrative dominance, the same ancient tension remained unresolved: human ambition, personal greed, political vanity. the qualities bureaucracy cannot fully absorb without eventually exposing. When criminal power fully enters politics, it stops thinking in days and begins thinking in election cycles. For the Sinaloa Cartel, this marked a turning point that was subtle, dangerous, and nearly irreversible. Power no longer depended on intimidation alone. It depended on continuity of office. An official was no longer valuable only for what he allowed today. He was valuable for what he could still influence tomorrow. And so relationships were built with patience instead of urgency. Campaign funding arrived early instead of late. Support was provided quietly instead of publicly. Promises were never recorded, only implied. What could not be proven could not be prosecuted as the years passed. This created an ecosystem where politics and criminal logistics moved along the same calendar without ever officially touching. Election seasons became periods of operational caution. Shifts in office created moments of recalibration. New administrations introduced temporary instability, then quickly settled into familiar patterns of accommodation. This rhythm made the system feel self-renewing, not permanent, but persistent enough to outlast any single investigation. Yet the most dangerous transformation during this period was psychological. Officials no longer saw themselves as compromised. They saw themselves as pragmatic. They told themselves, if we resist, violence returns. If we cooperate, stability remains. If stability remains, the public benefits. This logic slowly replaced the idea of duty with the idea of utility. And once duty loses its authority, legality becomes flexible. Within law enforcement, a similar distortion took place. Officers were no longer teaching recruits how to confront criminals. They were teaching them how to navigate limits, which investigations to push, which to delay, which to escalate, which to abandon quietly. These weren't orders. They were institutional instincts. And institutional instincts are far harder to uproot than commands. By this stage, the cartel did not need to demand protection. Protection had become ambient. It existed in soft decisions, in delayed signatures, in misplaced documents, in sudden changes of jurisdiction, in quiet reassignment of personnel. These were not dramatic acts of corruption. They were the daily weather of administrative influence. But ambient protection carries a fatal weakness. It depends on consistency, and consistency in human systems never lasts forever. Ambition began to ferment inside political structures. New officials wanted recognition rather than silence. Young administrators wanted reputations instead of maintenance. Some wanted to rise by exposing what their predecessors had concealed. Others wanted to build personal power rather than preserve inherited balance. This introduced volatility into a system that depended entirely on predictability. At the same time, a new generation of analysts emerged inside federal and international agencies. They were not hunting gunmen. They were hunting patterns. They studied procurement cycles, budget allocations, infrastructure anomalies, staffing, rotations, inspection, discrepancies, unusual stability in high-risk regions. They were not looking for criminals. They were looking for statistical distortion. And distortion is the one thing no bureaucracy can hide forever. Slowly, across unrelated regions, similar administrative fingerprints began to align. The same types of delays, the same styles of obstruction, the same phases of sudden cooperation followed by silence. These were no longer coincidences. They were signatures, and signatures, once identified, can be studied without ever confronting the people who created them. This was the true beginning of long-range institutional counterpressure. Not raids, not arrests, but mapping the shadow where governance consistently bent. Once that shadow is mapped, time becomes an enemy instead of an ally, because paper outlives people. Digital records persist longer than loyalty. Archive data does not forget. The phase of narcopolitics gave the cartel its deepest level of insulation, but it also planted the seeds of systemic vulnerability. Every document created to protect, it also became a potential thread for future unraveling. Every official who chose pragmatism over duty added another layer of exposure to a system that depended on remaining unseen. By the end of this era, something fundamental had changed. The cartel was no longer only a criminal organization. It had become a political environment. It shaped not only where illegal money went, but how legal decisions were slowed, shaped, and redirected to accommodate invisible flow. And yet, Beneath the appearance of permanence, a quiet pressure continued to build, not among gunmen, not among traffickers, but among auditors, data analysts, international task forces, and historians of institutional corruption, people who did not fear violence because violence could not reach them. Through spreadsheets and archived signatures. This is the paradox of political infiltration. It gives criminal power its greatest shield and its most permanent record. By the end of this phase, the organization stood at a strange summit, more protected than ever before, more embedded than ever before, more insulated than any cartel in history. And yet, for the first time, its greatest danger no longer came from rivals or enforcement on the streets. It came from time itself, patiently studying the shape of its accommodation. Chapter 7. Global War on Cartels. When the world finally looked directly at Sinaloa. For decades, the Sinaloa Cartel had existed in a paradox. Everyone knew it was there. Few could ever see it clearly. It moved through economies without wearing a single face. It shaped routes without declaring borders. It outlived leaders without collapsing into factions. Governments chased fragments while the whole remained just out of reach. But eventually, silence becomes too large to ignore. The first phase of the global war did not sound like war at all. It sounded like coordination. Agencies that had once worked in isolation began sharing data instead of summaries. Financial institutions that had once guarded client secrecy began adjusting compliance frameworks. Border authorities that had once acted on tip-based enforcement began shifting toward algorithmic risk models. This was not an escalation of force. It was an escalation of attention. And attention is the one thing large shadow systems fear most. For the first time, the pursuit was no longer regional, bilateral, or fragmented. It became continuous across continents, flowing through intelligence desks in languages that had never before spoken to one another in real time. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence began to align into visible structures. What had once looked like scattered crime now began to resemble an integrated architecture of trade distortion at a global scale. The cartel did not respond with violence. It responded with reconfiguration. Routes shifted. Finance relayered. Intermediaries rotated. Entire corridors went quiet while new ones activated elsewhere without announcing the transition. The organization had survived this type of pressure before, but never at this scale, and never with so many institutions learning how to observe the same shadow simultaneously. The first public signs of the global war arrived in headlines. Large seizures at international ports, simultaneous arrests across multiple countries, extraditions that once stalled now moved with unusual speed. The outside world. It looked sudden. Inside the system, it felt long overdue. For years, the cartel had relied on the gap between jurisdictions to survive. Now those gaps were shrinking, not closing entirely, but narrowing enough to change the mathematics of risk. For the first time, it was not only criminals adjusting to enforcement. Enforcement was adjusting to systemic crime. The psychological shift inside the organization was quiet but profound. For generations, its greatest advantage had been that it never needed to defeat the state directly. It only needed to outlast fragmented attention. Now attention itself was becoming continuous. The old model of letting pressure burn out no longer worked. Pressure was no longer episodic. It was persistent. This forced a return to an older survival logic. Not global optimization, but core protection. The cartel began pulling influence back inward toward its most defensible assets. International partnerships grew colder. Foreign corridors were delegated to local allies with looser ties. Direct control was replaced with layered distance. The objective was no longer perfect efficiency. It was containment of exposure. At the same time, something else began to change. Rivals felt the same pressure. Where once they had measured themselves against Sinaloa alone, now they measured themselves against the world. Some collapsed under the weight. Some grew more violent. Some attempted to mimic Sinaloa's patience without fully understanding its architecture. This created instability not just between cartels, but within them. The landscape grew louder, more chaotic, and chaos, for the first time in many years, created opportunities the cartel had not designed personally. In this period, violence across multiple regions spiked not because Sinaloa ordered it, but because its stabilizing gravity was being disrupted by global interference. For communities long accustomed to One dominant, invisible power. The change was disorienting. Predictable fear was replaced by unpredictable conflict. Where there had once been one shadow, there were now many smaller ones overlapping. The global war did not bring peace, that it brought fragmentation. Inside governments, the emotional tone of the pursuit also shifted. It first, the war had been framed as disruption. Now it was being framed as endurance. Officials stopped promising decisive victories. They began speaking about degradation over time. Not elimination, not eradication, but erosion. That language mattered. It acknowledged a truth rarely spoken aloud, that no organization of this size disappears quickly without tearing entire economic and political layers with it. This was no longer a hunt for fugitives. It was a long siege against infrastructure. Financial networks were the first battlefield to truly shift. Secrecy jurisdictions tightened. Wire transfers slowed. Data sharing between banks increased. Risk analytics became more aggressive. This did not stop money from moving. It made money anxious. And anxious money changes hands faster, hides less carefully, and leaves trails where patience once erased them. At the same time, extradition policies hardened. Where once political hesitation blocked transfers, now international pressure reframed refusal as complicity. Borders became less absolute. Legal distance shrank. For the first time, the idea that leadership could remain permanently shielded by geography began to feel uncertain. Inside the cartel, long-range planning adjusted accordingly. Layers became thicker. Communication narrower. Delegation expanded. Those closest to the center grew fewer. Those on the perimeter gained more autonomy and more risk. This redistribution of exposure created new tensions, not ideological, personal. Ambition thrives when pressure clarifies hierarchy. And under global scrutiny, hierarchy grows brittle. The greater danger did not come from raids or seizures. It came from the way pressure compressed internal loyalty. Some figures began preparing exit strategies quietly. Others built parallel corridors as insurance. A few sought legitimacy through investment, imagining futures outside the system that had built them. This was not betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was hedging against permanence. The global war did not break the cartel in one blow. It introduced uncertainty into a system that had long operated on patience and prediction. And uncertainty is corrosive to long-range criminal design. At the height of international pressure, one truth became unavoidable. The cartel had become too large to move as a single silent organism anymore. Movement created ripples now. No matter how carefully it was disguised. In that sense, the global war succeeded in one critical way, not by destroying the organization, but by making it audible again, not through gunfire, through data, financial anomalies, trade distortions, legal coordination, the sound of systems finally speaking to one another. Yet, even then, the organization did not vanish. It adapted, as it always had, reducing exposure, redistributing weight, letting momentum continue through fragments rather than through a single unified rhythm. The world had finally looked directly at Sinaloa, but Sinaloa had already begun looking beyond the shape it once held. Chapter 8. The Age of El Chapo, when one man became the face of a faceless empire. For most of its life, the Sinaloa Cartel had ruled without a single recognizable face. Power moved through corridors, through routes, through finances, through silence. But history has a tendency to simplify complex systems into singular figures, not because those figures built the system alone, but because the human mind needs a center. And so, inevitably, a man emerged from the layers, Joaquín El Chapo. Guzmán did not create the Sinaloa Cartel. The cartel created the conditions that allowed a man like him to rise to global visibility. That he was not the beginning, that he was the moment the invisible became visible. Inside the organization, he was never treated as a myth. He was treated as a perfect operator. That a man who understood routes as instinct. That a man who trusted patience over spectacle. That a man who could disappear inside logistics the same way others disappeared into crowds. What separated him was not brutality. That it was precision. He understood timing. He understood delegation. He understood when to move and when to wait. And most importantly, he understood the cartel's oldest rule: never reveal the full shape of what you truly control. As his influence grew, something dangerous happened. The outside world began to fuse his identity with the entire machine. Media narratives condensed a multi-generational transnational system into a single silhouette. Headlines simplified architecture into personality. A network that had avoided single-point failure for decades suddenly found itself associated with a single name. This was both an advantage and a looming risk. The advantage was illusion. The illusion that if one man fell, the system would follow. The risk was attention density. Attention that once diffused across hundreds of invisible operators now gathered around one figure. Inside Sinaloa, this shift was met with both opportunity and caution that on one hand, El Chapo's growing fame acted as a pressure valve. While the world chased one man, others moved more freely beneath the noise that on the other hand. The cartel had never depended on a single figure, and now, the world was beginning to behave as if it did. This created a delicate internal tension. How much visibility could be tolerated before it threatened the structure that visibility was masking? During this era, the organization entered a strange dual existence. To the public, it became the empire of one man. To itself, it remained a federation of systems that would never fully belong to one person. This duality allowed Sinaloa to appear vulnerable. While remaining functionally intact, El Chapo's reputation expanded. So did the mythology. Stories of impossible routes, that of tunnels, that of escapes, that of evasion that felt unreal. Some of these stories were true. Some were inflated by distance and repetition. But all of them served the same psychological function. They transformed logistics into legend. And legend is far more powerful than fact. Legend convinces rivals that resistance is futile. Legend convinces followers that permanence is guaranteed. And permanence, once believed, reshapes behavior without threats. Inside the cartel, however, nothing felt permanent. The age of visibility created constant recalibration. Routes were duplicated more aggressively. Delegation widened into deeper layers. Communication narrowed. Proximity to leadership became more dangerous than ever before, because now leadership attracted not only rivals, but international fixation. This period also reshaped the psychology of law enforcement. Once, they had chased organizations. Now, they chased a symbol. Every task force, briefing, and operation began pivoting around one name. This simplified messaging. It united agencies around a common target. It gave the global war a human anchor, but it also introduced a strategic blind spot. While everyone studied the man, the machine continued operating as the machine always had, without emotion, without ego, without fame. Inside communities, the age of El Chapo introduced a new cultural distortion. Children did not learn about systems. They learned about a figure, a name that felt larger than geography, a presence that seemed to bend walls and borders through sheer will. This distorted how power was understood. Instead of seeing how silence and logistics created dominance, many began believing that dominance came from audacity alone. This misconception would later cost many their lives, because audacity without architecture collapses quickly. As global pressure intensified, the cartel faced its greatest test of identity. Could it survive the illusion it had allowed to grow around one man? Or had the illusion become so powerful that reality would begin reshaping itself to match the myth? Internally, the response was quiet but deliberate. Power was spread wider, decision-making fragmented further. The cartel did not resist the narrative publicly. It shifted itself beneath it. Let the world believe what it needed to believe, and let the real work continue elsewhere. The age of El Chapo was not the age where one man ruled everything. It was the age where the world mistook a visible figure for an invisible system. This misunderstanding created both control and chaos. Control over narrative, chaos inside strategy. By the time the world came to fully associate Sinaloa with a single face, the organization had already begun preparing for the day when that face would no longer be available, not as a contingency, but as an inevitability. Because even the most legendary operators eventually meet the one condition that systems never do. An ending. And when that ending approached, the true architecture of Sinaloa would finally be tested in a way it had never been tested before, not by violence, not by rivals, but by the loss of the symbol the world had come to believe was the cartel. Chapter 9. The First Escape. when the world realized the myth could move. The first time the world believed the story had reached its end, it was mistaken. The capture of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was meant to be a closing note, a moment of public certainty, a signal that the long pursuit of a ghost had finally reached its conclusion. To the outside world, it looked like resolution. To the system that had shaped him, it looked like transition, because within the structure of the Sinaloa Cartel, capture did not always mean removal. Sometimes it meant repositioning. Behind the scenes of celebration and headlines, the machine did not pause. Routes did not freeze. Corridors did not collapse. Finances did not scatter. The system adjusted its breathing, and in that adjustment, the conditions for something unprecedented began quietly forming. Inside confinement, the idea of stillness did not behave the way the public imagined it would. Walls existed, schedules existed, rules existed, but inside complex systems, rules are only as stable as the pressure around them. From the outside, the structure appeared immovable. From the inside, it was already being studied, not with haste, with patience. Days turned into months, months into routines, and routines into patterns. Patterns, once learned, become vulnerabilities. While the world believed the symbol was contained, the organization made a deliberate shift. Visibility narrowed. High-profile movement slowed. Attention was allowed to settle fully on one figure. This served two purposes at once. It focused external pressure away from secondary corridors, and it allowed internal resources to concentrate quietly on one precise problem: not rescue, extraction. What unfolded next was not sudden. It was constructed in increments too small to attract alarm. Materials moved without purpose attached to them. Labor shifted without visible destination. Communication thinned and thickened along rhythms that mimicked ordinary institutional noise. From above, nothing appeared unusual. From inside the pattern, everything was aligning. The concept of escape has always carried a dramatic meaning for the public. A dash, the confrontation, a sudden burst of defiance. What actually unfolded carried none of that. It unfolded as absence. One moment, presence was assumed. The next, presence could no longer be verified. And in between those 2 points was not chaos, but a space where certainty quietly collapsed. When the world learned what had happened, reaction came in waves: shock first, then disbelief, then speculation. How could this have occurred inside a place designed for permanence? The answers were not cinematic. They were systemic. Public explanations focused on the surface. On personnel. On surveillance gaps. On structural oversights. But beneath those explanations lived the deeper truth that any system designed by humans carries within it assumption, trust, routine, and routine is always the enemy of permanence. The escape did not only remove a man from a controlled environment. It disrupted belief. Belief that visibility equals containment. Belief that symbols can be caged. Belief that architecture always defeats patience. For institutions built on symbolic authority, this was the deepest wound. Not operational failure, but psychological fracture. For the organization, the aftermath unfolded differently. There was no celebration, no announcement, no surge of chaos. Movement resumed exactly as it had before, which was the message, not triumph. Continuity. The system had passed through the illusion of finality and emerged unchanged. And that fact altered every future pursuit afterward. Inside global law enforcement, something subtle shifted. Pursuit hardened. Narratives cooled. The idea of decisive capture lost credibility. From that moment on, containment was no longer treated as an endpoint. It became a temporary phase in a longer cycle. The chase no longer assumed conclusion. It assumed recurrence. The myth that had been simplified around one man now expanded outward again, that he was no longer a fixed point. He was proof that motion still existed beneath surveillance, that systems still contained blind spots, that architecture, no matter how reinforced, still depended on human maintenance. Within communities, the escape became legend, not because of spectacle, but because of implication. It suggested that boundaries were permeable in ways people had been taught to believe no longer existed. It suggested that permanence itself was negotiable, and once permanence becomes negotiable, behavior changes everywhere. Fear reshapes itself. Caution deepens. Hope distorts. Yet the most significant impact of the first escape was not emotional. It was strategic. From that point forward, international agencies did not chase a man alone. They began chasing a method. A way of thinking. A way of exploiting routine. A way of allowing systems to dismantle themselves through overconfidence. The escape was not an ending. It was a declaration made without words, that the story had not yet converted into stillness, that the myth was not bound by the walls meant to teach it finality, that the world had underestimated the patience woven into the architecture. Beneath the symbol, and somewhere far beyond the noise of reaction, the organization observed one more quiet truth being confirmed, that even inside the most reinforced spaces, time still belonged to those who were willing to wait. Chapter 10. Hunting a Shadow. When the world turned the chase into a siege. After the first escape, the pursuit of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán changed its nature. Before, it had been a manhunt. After, it became a containment doctrine. The world no longer believed that capture meant conclusion. It believed only that capture meant delay. And delay, in this story, had already proven itself fragile. The chase widened, not across streets, across systems. Financial analysts began tracing invisible currents rather than visible transactions. Communications experts listened for rhythm rather than words. Logistics specialists stopped studying what moved and began studying what stopped moving unexpectedly. This was no longer about footsteps. It was about absence as evidence. Inside the global pursuit, something else began to harden. Patience was replaced by relentlessness, not loud, not frantic, relentless in the way ice moves, slow, unavoidable, unimpressed by resistance. Every corridor became conditional. Every contact became provisional. Every movement carried the assumption that it might be the last. Before silence closed again, for the first time, the world arranged its attention not around speed, but around compression of space over time. Inside the Sinaloa Cartel, the psychological climate shifted sharply. The escape had proven what was possible. The siege now tested what was sustainable. Layers tightened. Communication thinned to channels that existed only for moments before dissolving again. Movement abandoned continuity. One traveled the same route twice in a predictable rhythm. The organization did not fear pursuit. It feared prediction. Communities that had once felt distant from international pressure now sensed the tightening air. Helicopters did not linger. They passed briefly, then returned days later without pattern. Roadblocks appeared without staying. Faces changed too often to memorize. This was not presence meant to intimidate. It was presence meant to disorient familiarity itself. Inside governments, language shifted again. Officials no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of disruption density. How often could movement be interrupted without triggering public chaos? How many corridors could be narrowed before adaptation stalled? How long could pressure be maintained without exhausting the very institutions applying it? The war became a calculation of fatigue, not just against the target, against the pursuers themselves. The siege did not look like war. It looked like administration under strain. Budgets expanded quietly. Task forces multiplied. Jurisdictional lines blurred further. What had once been isolated agencies now functioned as parts of a single elongated instrument. Instruments do not announce themselves. They resonate. For the symbol at the center of the chase, life no longer resembled freedom. It resembled intervals. Intervals of movement. Intervals of concealment. Intervals of enforced stillness. Each interval grew shorter, not because options vanished overnight, but because options narrowed under invisible arithmetic. The siege also tested the organization's central design principle, redundancy. But redundancy under global pressure behaves differently. When one corridor closes locally, another elsewhere can open. When many corridors close simultaneously across regions, redundancy becomes congestion. Congestion invites exposure. Exposure invites convergence. Internally, this produced a rare condition. Fragments began to feel the weight of the whole. Operators at the edges sensed pressure that once absorbed quietly elsewhere. Foreign partners grew hesitant. Local intermediaries delayed. Distance, once protective, now introduced delay where precision had once existed. This was not collapse. It was friction, and friction is how motion turns into heat. The world, meanwhile, mistook silence for failure. Headlines cooled. Visibility dimmed. Some began to believe the chase had lost its urgency. Inside the siege, urgency had never been higher. Because silence no longer meant freedom. It meant compression. The turning point did not arrive with noise. It arrived with coincidence. A misaligned schedule. A delayed signal. A marginal interception that revealed too much of a pattern too quickly. Convergence does not need certainty. It needs density. Enough overlapping probabilities begin to resemble inevitability. For the organization, the moment did not feel like betrayal. It felt like geometry tightening. Lines intersecting that had once run parallel. Distance folding in on itself. Time shortening. For the world, what followed would look decisive. For those inside the layers, it had been forming quietly for months. The siege did not end the shadow. It caught up to it. For the first time, without needing it to stumble publicly. And yet, even as the net began to close in dimensions too subtle to photograph, the old truth still held. The system had been built never to depend on one man's motion alone. Whatever happened next, the machine was already preparing itself to continue breathing without the figure the world had chosen to chase. Chapter 11. The second capture, when patience finally closed the distance. The second capture did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with inevitability. By the time Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán re-entered the world's fixed coordinates, the shape of pursuit had already changed. This was no longer a chase measured in footsteps or headlines. It was measured in overlap of jurisdictions, of data, of probability. The distance did not shrink with speed. It shrank with alignment. For the Sinaloa Cartel, the pressure had become ambient. Not the explosive kind that provokes reaction, but the steady kind that narrows options without announcing itself. Movement still existed, but it was constrained movement. Intervals inside a corridor that was quietly thinning. The world believes second chances end with spectacle. This one ended with convergence. What made the second capture different was not the moment itself. It was the way time had been reorganized around it. After the first escape, enforcement stopped waiting for certainty. It learned to wait for density. Not proof, not confession, not dramatic collapse. Only enough overlapping signals to make motion feel unsafe everywhere at once. Financial patterns tightened, logistical rhythms shortened, communications avoided permanence and still left echoes. Each echo alone meant little. Together, they formed a narrowing. Inside the organization, the psychological tone shifted from confidence to calculation. Not panic, not surrender. Calculation, the state where every movement is weighed against the cost of stillness. At this stage, stillness itself begins to feel like exposure. You can hide from eyes, but you cannot hide from probability once it accrues. The system that had always thrived on patience now faced a paradox of its own creation. Patience had trained the world how to wait. The capture came without the pageantry of triumph, NO battalions, NO declarations. Just a sudden halt in a rhythm that had been carefully irregular for years. For the public, it looked like an outcome. For the system, it felt like a pivot point already priced in, because long before the moment itself, the machine had been instructed how to breathe without that movement. Redundancy had been prepared, delegation had been widened, distance had been layered into every sensitive node. The symbol was about to be removed. The structure had already adjusted in the hours that followed. Reactions traveled faster than clarity. Governments spoke in the language of closure. Media spoke in the language of finality. Communities spoke in whispers, measuring what would change and what would not. But inside the deeper systems, the response was remarkably quiet. NO mass retaliation, NO sudden vacuumed, NO convulsion. Just redistribution. Routes that had already been delegated settled more firmly into local responsibility. Financial corridors shortened their chains of custody. Communications became narrower, not louder. The moment passed through the network like a pressure wave absorbed by strategic insulation. That was the unsettling part for those who had waited for collapse. There wasn't one. The second capture did something more subtle than ending motion. It changed the meaning of motion. From this point forward, leadership could no longer rely on the myth of perpetual displacement. The world had proven it could compress distance without spectacle. That capability would not be unlearned. For the cartel, this introduced a new calculus. Not whether capture was possible, but whether visibility itself had become incompatible with longevity. Inside confinement, control returned in a different form, not the illusion of stillness, but the reality of irrelevance to immediate flow. Time reorganized itself into cycles without destination. The future ceased to be a terrain that could be shaped through movement. It became a schedule enforced by walls and procedure. This is the quietest ending power can meet, not defeat, disengagement. Outside, the chase did not stop. It changed targets, not away from the organization, away from the symbol. Analysts returned their attention to corridors that no longer wore a face. Investigators pivoted back to financial deltas that did not require the presence of a particular person to exist. The war was no longer about one silhouette. It was about method again. The chase returned to where it had always been most dangerous, the invisible. For the public, the second capture flirted with the idea of conclusion. For policymakers, it marked a reset of expectations. More believing that one arrest can end a system. More believing that icons carry infrastructure on their backs. More believing that endings arrive in neat chapters. What arrived instead was an understanding that systems, trained for redundancy, do not end. They shed layers. The symbolic power of the moment was undeniable. But symbolic power does not dismantle logistics. It does not unwind financial convolution. It does not teach communities new habits overnight. It marks a transition. Nothing more. In the months that followed, the world watched for convulsion. It never came. Violence shifted in places. Competition flared elsewhere. But the central rhythm, the one built on patience, delegation, and diffusion, continued to move, as if it had already crossed the threshold long before the moment itself was visible. There is a unique stillness that follows the second capture of a figure the world believes defines a machine. A stillness filled not with peace, but with recalibration. The machine that once carried the symbol forward now confirms whether it truly needed it. The answer arrived quietly, not in headlines. In continuity. Chapter 12. Extradition, when distance could no longer protect the symbol. For most of its history, the greatest shield around Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán had not been walls. It had been distance. Distance between jurisdictions, distance between legal systems, distance between political wills that rarely moved in perfect synchrony. For decades, this distance had functioned like a natural barrier. It slowed pressure. It softened consequences. It fragmented authority. But after the second capture, something rare began to form. Not outrage, not spectacle, alignment. Extradition is not a dramatic act when it works properly. It is administrative. Filed requests, signed documents, quiet diplomatic exchanges, calendars adjusted between offices that rarely appear in headlines. Yet behind this ordinary procedure lives a profound transformation of power. Extradition means that geography no longer negotiates with consequence. It means distance has failed. For the Sinaloa Cartel, this moment carried a different meaning than the one presented to the public. The public, it looked like final isolation. The system, it looked like symbol removal across the last remaining protective boundary. Borders had once slowed pursuit. Now borders were dissolving into corridors of legal handoff. Inside institutions, the tone was restrained. No official wanted to frame the moment as victory, because victory implies finality, and nothing about this system had ever offered finality before. Instead, language shifted to terms like transfer, custody, jurisdictional completion, judicial consolidation, dry words. But behind them lived a sharp truth, that the last wide gap in the pursuit had been sealed. The process itself moved with strange calm, security without ceremony, procedures without commentary, timelines confirmed without countdown. This absence of drama was intentional, because drama invites interference, and this moment was being protected not with noise, but with silence disciplined to its finest edge. For the figure at the center, the transfer represented a kind of existential narrowing that no wall ever accomplished. Not just physical relocation, but narrative relocation. The story was leaving the world where evasion had once shaped its myth and entering a space where time would be governed by procedural certainty rather than movement. The difference between hiding and waiting is not always visible from the outside. Inside, it transforms perception. Completely. The handoff completed. Something rare unfolded in the global criminal imagination. The myth of inviolable distance collapsed. For generations, geography had been the final guarantee. Mountains, borders, jurisdictional hesitation, all had once served as buffers between power and permanence. Now, even the buffer had been neutralized. Inside Sinaloa's deeper layers, reaction arrived quietly. There was no scrambled, no emergency counseled, no violent signaling, because the structure had already learned to function without proximity to the symbol the world had chased. Extradition was not a shock. It was the confirmation of a transition already priced into design. The machine had moved on before the paperwork ever finished moving. For enforcement agencies, the emotional shift was more complex. Extradition felt like proximity, proximity to final judgment, proximity to decisive narrative closure. But proximity is not the same as conclusion, and many inside the system knew that even this milestone did not mean the architecture itself had been dismantled. It only meant the story had crossed into a different legal dimension. Inside the legal arena that now awaited, time would no longer belong to evasion. It would belong to schedules, TO motions, TO arguments paced by calendars rather than instinct. This change is subtle but absolute. Where speed once determined survival, now delay would be the only remaining tool. In communities that had lived beneath shifting shadows for decades, extradition carried an ambiguous resonance. Some felt relief, not because danger vanished, but because one part of the story had finally stopped moving. Others felt uncertainty, because stillness often feels more dangerous than motion when you have learned to survive under rhythm. Either way, something had changed, not in violence. In psychological gravity. The symbol had been pulled out of the geography where it once bent perception. Media narratives framed the moment as culmination, but inside institutions, few believed in culmination anymore. They believed in transition between phases of long pressure, from pursuit to prosecution, from capture to containment by law rather than by walls. The extradition did not end the system that had produced the symbol, but it changed the conditions under which that symbol could still influence perception. That no more corridors, no more intervals, no more shadowed choices made between jurisdictions that hesitated to speak directly to one another. Now there was only procedure, without escape. For the larger architecture of the cartel, this represented the cleanest separation it had ever experienced between its structure and the face the world had assigned to it. There would be no more movement from that figure, no more disappearance, no more reemergence. Only a slow compression of narrative into testimony, evidence, and judgment. This is one of the most unsettling truths in all long criminal histories. The end of motion does not feel like drama. It feels like paperwork. And paperwork, once it begins at this level, rarely reverses itself. The world often imagines that justice arrives loudly. In this case, it arrived by calendar. Chapter 13. Trial of a Titan. When the invisible was forced into language. For most of its existence, the power associated with Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán lived where language could not easily reach it. In whispers. In coded transactions. In gestures understood only by those who already knew. The trial changed that. For the first time, an invisible system was required to translate itself into words, dates, documents, and testimony. What had once moved through instinct and silence now had to be arranged into sentences spoken aloud under oath. The transformation was quiet, but it was absolute. Courtrooms are strange arenas for stories born in secrecy. They demand linear narratives where none had ever existed. They demand singular responsibility where systems had always been shared. They demand clarity where power once thrived on ambiguity. Inside this space, the myth contracted into evidence, not legend, not rumor, record. From the outside, the trial looked like theater. Media crowds, carefully chosen words, faces flickering across screens. But inside the legal machinery, the work was unemotional, methodical. Evidence did not attempt to explain the full architecture. It did not need to. It only needed to prove enough. Enough connections, enough directives, enough moments where silence could no longer be defended as coincidence. For the Sinaloa Cartel, the trial created an unusual form of pressure, not on its active corridors, but on its memory. Stories that had once belonged only to participants were now detached from them and placed into public narrative. This did not affect logistics. It affected legacy. Because once a story enters public language, it no longer belongs entirely to those who lived it. Witnesses spoke in fragments, not epic arcs, fragments of routes, fragments of handoffs, fragments of decisions once made in rooms without clocks. The court assembled these fragments into structures no one inside the system had ever bothered to describe out loud. The truth did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a reconstruction. For the figure at the center of the room, the experience of the trial was profoundly different from the experience of pursuit. Pursuit is movement. Trial is definition. Every accusation is an attempt to replace ambiguity with boundary. Every question is an attempt to pin motion to memory, and memory, once formalized, loses the flexibility that once made it powerful. The defense did not battle the system. It battled interpretation. It questioned motives. It questioned timing. It questioned credibility. Not to dismantle the full narrative, but to blur its edges. This is the only space left to maneuver when corridors are gone. Language becomes the last remaining terrain of movement. The world watched not because it expected new answers, but because it wanted ceremonial closure. The need for ending is ancient. It is the need to believe that stories resolve rather than simply transform. But inside this courtroom, the shape of the truth resisted that impulse. It did not feel like an ending. It felt like a translation of one form of power into another form of record. For communities once shaped by fear of presence, the trial introduced a new kind of distance, not geographic, psychological. The figure who had once felt omnipresent was now confined to routine. To calendar dates, to scheduled appearances, to the slow compression of life into procedural waiting. This did not erase memory, but it rearranged its weight. Inside global institutions, the trial functioned as a rare convergence point. Years of fragmented intelligence were finally speaking in the same room, not flexing, not competing, but aligning. This alignment was not dramatic. It was administrative. And administration is where modern power truly settles. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Something subtle occurred inside the collective perception of the story. It grew less mysterious, not because all was revealed, but because familiarity reduces myth. When you see the same room repeatedly, when you hear the same voice repeatedly, when time begins to repeat without transformation, legend begins to erode into routine, and routine is the final enemy of myth. The verdict, when it arrived, did not reverberate the way the capture had. It did not feel like conquest. It felt like confirmation of something the machinery had been moving toward for years. There were no cheers inside institutions trained never to celebrate outcomes in stories that can always outlast them. There was simply acknowledgement. A box checked. A phase closed. Yet even here, at the point the public understood as finality, those who studied systems understood something quieter. The trial marked the end of one visible narrative, not the end of the architecture that had once hosted it. Because courts do not dismantle supply chains, they do not erase logistical grammars. They do not unwind cultural adaptations that have shaped behavior for generations. They only define responsibility within language. The trial forced the invisible to speak. It did not force it to disappear. And as the room emptied and calendars advanced beyond the dates people would one day remember, the most powerful truth lingered behind the ceremony. That a system can be named without ever being owned by the name the world chooses to give it. Chapter 14. Life without motion, when power met stillness. For a man whose life had been measured in movement, distance, and evasion, stillness was not a condition he had ever truly learned. Now, it was the only condition left. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán entered a phase of existence where the world no longer responded to his decisions. Doors opened and closed on schedules not influenced by negotiation. Light arrived and vanished according to institutional rhythm rather than strategy. The future no longer stretched outward as terrain to be crossed. It folded inward, into hours, into silence, into repetition. Power behaves differently when motion is removed from it. On the outside, power feels like pressure, influence, leverage. On the inside of stillness, power becomes memory without direction. The past exists in full clarity. The future loses its shape. Every routine becomes identical to the last. Every choice becomes symbolic rather than practical, not because choices disappear, but because they no longer change anything. For the world, the presence of stillness created a strange illusion of completion. News cycles shifted, public attention diffused. The shadow that had once occupied international focus receded slowly into historical framing. But systems do not dissolve simply because attention leaves them. They reorganize quietly. Inside the broader structure of the Sinaloa Cartel, the absence was not dramatic. There was no rupture in corridors, no sudden vacuum of command at no violent contest for inheritance, because inheritance had already been designed to function without central motion. Leadership in this system never depended on one figure's visibility. It depended on distributed silence. And distributed silence is not broken by removal, it is confirmed by it. For those who had once lived beneath towering myth, the disappearance into stillness created emotional disorientation. Some expected collapse, others expected vengeance. Neither arrived. Instead, life continued. Adjusted slightly, not safer, not more dangerous, simply different in texture. Myth is loud, stillness is quiet. Quiet changes how fear behaves. Inside institutional walls, time no longer behaved as pressure. It became measurement, length of sentence, distance between appeals, intervals between procedural motions. Time ceased to feel like something to outrun. It became something to endure, and endurance, when stripped of outcome, produces a condition far heavier than panic. It produces irrelevance to consequence. For the system that had once adapted endlessly around one figure, the arrival of permanent stillness confirmed something essential, that its core had always been architectural, not personal, that movement was a feature, not a foundation, that visibility had always been a temporary narrative illusion floating above deeper mechanics. The world often imagines that stillness is defeat. In truth, stillness is separation, separation from leverage, separation from negotiation, separation from any action that can reshape tomorrow. It is not punishment in the physical sense. It is punishment in the existential one. Inside communities once shaped by omnipresent danger, a generational shift was quietly unfolding. New lives carried memories not of legend, but of aftermath, not of movement, but of inherited caution. Children no longer whispered one name. They learned many. The idea of singular fear dissolved into generalized uncertainty, which is often more persistent. In political spaces, the removal of a symbol created a false sense of resolution. Budgets were redirected, task forces restructured, priorities renamed. The narrative of victory was allowed to circulate for a while. Narratives are useful. They provide pauses, but pauses are not conclusions. They are simply moments where pressure rearranges itself quietly. The strange truth about life without motion is that it does not immediately end influence. Influence decays differently, slowly, through absence from decision points, through the emergence of new voices that no longer require reference to the old one. Through silence becoming irrelevant rather than strategic. Relevance is the final currency of power. Once it fades, the echo remains, but the echo no longer directs the world. In the deepest layers of institutional time, memory began to restructure the story, from urgent pursuit to archived case, from active threat to historical framework. History has a way of neutralizing even the most destabilizing forces by changing the tense they live in. What was present becomes past. What was feared becomes studied. What was chased becomes analyzed. Life without motion is not dramatic. It does not shake structures. It does not summon new battles. It simply allows the world to continue reorganizing without reference to the figure who once seemed to define it. For the cartel's architecture, this phase confirmed what it had always believed, that no individual, no matter how visible, is larger than the system that learned to survive invisibly long before him. And yet, despite everything that had been neutralized, displaced, or archived, one question still lingered across institutions, communities, and the criminal landscape itself. Not whether the symbol had ended, but whether the force that produced it had truly been altered or merely confirmed in its oldest design principle, that even when motion stops, the machine continues to breathe. Chapter 15. What remains when silence becomes the last legacy? When the movement finally ends, what remains is not the man, What remains is what the world learned while trying to stop the machine around him. Long after Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán passed into stillness, the systems shaped during his era continued to breathe. Routes shifted, alliances fractured and reformed. Corridors that once operated quietly were replaced by new ones that moved faster, risked more, and lasted less. History does not pause when a symbol disappears. It rearranges itself. For the Sinaloa Cartel, the final transition did not feel like loss. It felt like rebalancing. The organization had been preparing for this condition for decades. Redundancy had always been its true leader. Delegation, its true defense. Silence, its most durable shield. When the figure vanished from relevance, the deeper architecture did not need to announce survival. It simply continued operating in patterns too ordinary to resemble crisis. This is the strength of systems that never depend on a single center. Across the wider criminal landscape, the absence created motion. Rivals surged. Fragmented groups attempted imitation. Short-lived empires formed with explosive force and collapsed just as quickly. Where Sinaloa had learned to grow slowly and quietly, a new generation of organizations chased visibility, intimidation, and speed. They gained territory loudly. They lost it loudly too. This created a world that felt more violent and less stable. The silence that once suppressed chaos had thinned. Inside governments, the tone of the long war shifted again. There were no more global announcements no more singular targets that could unify attention. The fight returned to what it had always struggled with most: networks without faces, money without scent, routes without borders, criminal economies without ceremonial leadership. This is where the war becomes infinitely slower and infinitely harder to measure. Inside communities once shaped by predictable fear, change did not arrive as safety. It arrived as uncertainty. Predictable shadows vanished. Unpredictable ones emerged. Where once there had been one dominant order beneath the chaos, now there were many competing disturbances. For ordinary families, this did not feel like victory. It felt like the familiar rules had vanished, and when rules vanish, survival becomes improvisation. Memory also began to shift. For one generation, the story remained personal. Names carried emotion. Fear carried rhythm. For the next generation, the story grew abstract, a tale inherited rather than lived, a reference point rather than a condition. This is how even the darkest eras begin to lose their grip. Not through justice, but through distance. Inside institutions, the legacy became procedural. New training manuals referenced learned failures. New security doctrines incorporated the patience once underestimated. New financial oversight frameworks reflected lessons carved out of decades of invisible trade. These changes did not name their origin aloud. They did not need to. The architecture of prevention now carried the imprint of the pursuit that built it. The final truth of the story is not that one man rose and fell. It is that the world learned how a shadow can become global, without ever needing to announce itself, and how difficult it is to unwind something once it learns to hide inside normal function. What remains is not a dramatic ending. There is no final confrontation. No cleansing silence. Only persistence. Persistence of altered routes. Of altered enforcement. Of altered expectations. The world that exists after the era does not look like the world that came before it. Even if most people never notice the difference. The quiet lesson of this entire story is not about crime. It is about structure. That what is built patiently survives longer than what is built loudly. That what is distributed is harder to remove than what is centralized. That what adapts quietly outlives what resists openly. And in the end, when all movement has narrowed into memory, when the symbol fades completely into archive, the machine does not roar. It does not collapse. It simply becomes another layer of the world's hidden architecture, neither celebrated nor truly erased, just present in the way only long shadows remain after the sun has moved on. This is how the story does not end with an event, but with a condition. A condition where silence itself becomes the final legacy. Chapter 16. The world after Sinaloa, when the shadow learned to multiply. The end of one era rarely sounds like an ending. It sounds like rearrangement. After the symbol faded into stillness, after the myth surrendered its movement to history, the world did not become quieter. It became busier. The removal of a single focal point created space, and space, in criminal ecosystems, is never empty for long. For the Sinaloa Cartel, the after effect did not feel like collapse, that it felt like fragmentation by design. For decades, the system had trained itself never to depend on a single voice. Now that philosophy expressed itself with full clarity. Corridors that had once synchronized loosely began operating with greater autonomy. Financial structures rebalanced under new hands. Decision-making splintered into faster, smaller, more volatile centers of gravity. The machine did not disappear, it multiplied quietly. What followed was not a vacuum, it was a surge. Across Mexico and beyond, rival structures expanded into pressure zones once held in balance. Some moved with the patience Sinaloa had perfected. Others arrived with speed, spectacle, and open confrontation. This is when the map of power stopped looking layered and began looking fractured. One of the most significant forces to rise into this reshaped landscape was the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, where Sinaloa had mastered silence. This new force embraced visibility. Where Sinaloa avoided spectacle, this one leaned into intimidation. Power returned to noise. Public signal, overt confrontation. And the criminal world, long accustomed to quiet hierarchies, was forced to recalibrate under a language it had almost forgotten. This shift did something profound to the emotional climate of communities. Under Sinaloa's long, shadowed balance, fear had been predictable. Routes were understood. Boundaries, though dangerous, were familiar. Now, fear became erratic. Violence no longer moved according to patient logistics. It surged according to momentum and retaliation. Predictability collapsed into volatility. For ordinary people, this did not feel like liberation. It felt like standing inside a storm whose patterns no longer repeated. Inside governments, the challenge changed shape as well. The long war against one dominant architecture became a conflict against multiple competing fragments, each smaller than the original, but collectively louder and harder to compress. This fractured reality is far more difficult to contain. Because fragmentation resists single-target solutions, you cannot decapitate a swarm. Financial systems also felt the transition. Under the old order, money moved through deeply embedded, stabilized corridors. After the transition, money became more mobile, more speculative, and more exposed. New laundering structures emerged rapidly, then collapsed rapidly. Risk increased, and where risk increases, mistakes become visible more often. The global shadow economy grew louder not because it grew larger, but because it grew less disciplined at the cultural level. The story transformed once again. The age of one shadow gave way to the age of many. Children no longer learned a single name as a warning. They learned several. The idea of a central criminal gravity dissolved into the idea of constant competition. This changed how younger generations understood power, not as patience, but as speed, not as silence, but as dominance. It is a different lesson and far more dangerous over time. For analysts and historians, this period revealed one of the most unsettling truths of all. That systems which survive too long eventually teach their enemies how to imitate their strengths and abandon their restraints. Sinaloa had taught the world how to build invisible supply chains. The next generation learned the techniques, but not the discipline. Across borders, law enforcement faced a paradox. While one giant shadow had been neutralized at the level of symbol and leadership, the total volume of criminal complexity increased rather than decreased. More groups, more routes, more alliances, more betrayals. The war did not end it decentralized. Inside the remnants of Sinaloa's architecture, transformation continued quietly. Some factions pursued legitimacy through business. Others doubled down on trafficking. Some became shadows within shadows, no longer requiring recognition. The identity of the cartel itself became harder to define as an object. It became a lineage of method rather than a banner of allegiance. This is the final irony of long criminal dominance. When a system survives long enough, it stops being a thing and becomes a template. A way of thinking. A way of hiding. A way of building power without standing in front of it. The world after Sinaloa is not a world without cartels. It is a world where cartels are more numerous, less stable, and far louder. It is a world where the silence that once governed the underworld has thinned into overlapping echoes of ambition. And somewhere beneath that chaos, the original lesson still lingers, mostly unspoken. That the most dangerous criminal power is not the one that shouts. It is the one that teaches the world how to move quietly, then vanishes before the lesson can ever be fully unlearned. Chapter 17. The Cartel Economy, when crime became a market without borders. Long after the era of dominant shadows began to fragment, one force remained constant. Money, not as currency alone, but as gravity. Even as old hierarchies dissolved and new factions competed for instability, the underground economy did not collapse. It expanded, quietly at first, then relentlessly. What had once been a network of routes became a marketplace without walls. And markets do not disappear when leadership changes. They adapt. By the time the world began to speak about the decline of old cartel empires, the deeper criminal economy had already completed its transformation. It no longer relied on one organization's discipline. It relied on global demand synchronized with global logistics. The shadow economy had outgrown its founders. What once belonged to the Sinaloa Cartel as a method now existed as a template shared across continents. The most dangerous shift in this new era was not territorial. It was financial. Drug revenue stopped being treated only as disposable cash. It became investment capital, speculative leverage, real estate liquidity, startup funding, corporate acquisition influence. Criminal wealth no longer waited to be hidden. It sought to be reincorporated at scale. Cities began absorbing invisible capital in ways few could fully trace. Luxury high rises rose where local income could never justify them. Tourism infrastructure expanded beyond realistic demand curves. Logistics hubs multiplied in places once considered marginal for trade. From the outside, this looked like economic growth. Inside the numbers, it looked like financial distortion, because the money did not behave like legal investment. It moved faster, exited sooner, and returned with different faces. As the cartel economy matured, it detached from geography. You no longer needed to control territory to control profit. You needed to control access to liquidity. This changed the structure of criminal power more than any war ever had. Gunmen became secondary. Traffickers became replaceable. Accountants, brokers, and facilitators became central. Crime learned to wear suits not only for protection, but for multiplication. With this financial evolution came a new psychological environment for those who participated. Violence was no longer the primary incentive. Scale was the an operator no longer measured success by fear. He measured it by balance sheets. Not what he controlled, but how efficiently he could enter and exit markets. This created a colder, more detached style of criminal ambition, and detachment makes risk feel abstract. As financial entanglement deepened, a strange reversal occurred. Communities once affected directly by drug corridors began feeling less immediate violence, while communities far from trafficking routes began absorbing the economic consequences without realizing their origin. Housing markets inflated. Local businesses shifted ownership repeatedly. Development booms arrived without explanation. Crime no longer announced itself with sirens. It announced itself with abnormal prosperity. International banking regulators began confronting a disturbing pattern. Illicit funds were not hiding in obvious secrecy jurisdictions anymore. They were flowing through mid-tier financial institutions, investment funds with layered ownership, complex corporate mergers, transnational real estate financing vehicles. Each layer added distance, and distance creates plausible denial. By the time suspicion formed, proof had already changed hands multiple times. For governments, this created a conflict with no clear battlefield. There was no single organization to target, no unified command to disrupt, no throne to decapitate. There was only market behavior, quietly distorted from within. At the same time, criminal competition intensified through economic tactics. Rather than violence, rivals stopped assassinating each other's leaders. They shorted each other's businesses, disrupted supply contracts, manipulated transport pricing, interfered with regulatory approvals. Conflict became corporate before it became physical, and corporate conflict is far harder to detect as criminal intent. The public still imagine cartel warfare as gunfire and chaos. But the real war increasingly took place inside. Loan documents, shipping insurance policies, port access, agreements, construction contracts, trade compliance loopholes. The battlefield had entered the language of commerce in this new era. Power no longer belonged to those who frightened the most people. It belonged to those who understood the architecture of money itself, who could bend it without breaking it, who could exit invisibly when pressure gathered, who could reappear with a new name, a new company, a new jurisdiction. The most unsettling truth of the post-empire era is this: even if every remaining cartel collapsed tomorrow, the market they helped build would still exist, because markets do not depend on identity. They depend on repetition of desire, and desire has no loyalty to law. The cartel economy became the longest surviving monument of every fallen syndicate, an economy that no longer needs banners and no longer needs legends, only demand, and the invisible systems willing to serve it. Chapter 18. The New Kings, when noise replaced silence. After the age of long shadows faded, the world did not return to quiet. It grew louder. Where the old order had moved through silence, the new one announced itself with echoes that traveled faster than rumor ever had. Videos, public threats, visible convoys, performative dominance. The era that followed was not defined by one empire. It was defined by competition for attention. The old architecture, perfected by the Sinaloa Cartel, had relied on something most rivals never fully respected: restraint. Not moral restraint, strategic restraint. The new generation rejected that idea. They believed power lived in spectacle. They believed fear required visibility. They believed dominance must be seen to be real. And so the sound returned. One of the most visible forces to rise during this transformation was the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Where the old empire avoided banners, this one raised them. Where the old empire softened borders through silence, this one challenged them openly. Where the old order dissolved into logistics, the new one leaned into declaration. Power was no longer hidden carefully beneath commerce. It was displayed. This did something profound to the emotional landscape of criminal authority. Under silence, fear had been psychological. Under noise, fear became theatrical. Threats were not whispered, they were broadcast. Control was no longer implied. It was staged. This changed how rivals responded. And more importantly, it changed how communities experienced danger. In the past, harm often arrived without warning. Now, warnings arrived first. Messages preceded action. Violence became a form of communication rather than a quiet consequence of logistics. This did not make life safer. It made it unpredictably intense. The new kings did not inherit patience. They inherited momentum. They expanded rapidly, sometimes too rapidly. They seized territory in dramatic bursts and lost it just as dramatically when alliances fractured or attention became unbearable. This volatility created cycles the old systems had always avoided: surge, collapse, realignment, surge again. Where silence had produced slow, stable dominance, noise produced fast, unstable empires. Inside governments, the response changed with the sound. Silence is difficult to mobilize against. Noise is easy to frame as crisis. Emergency deployments replaced long observation. Public operations replaced quiet tracking. Announcements replaced analysis. Pressure returned to the visible, and visibility reshaped enforcement priorities. Media narratives followed the same gravity. Long stories of patience gave way to breaking updates. One leader replaced another in headlines within weeks. The new order produced constant succession without conclusion. That era lasted long enough to harden into legend. The new kings ruled differently not because they understood systems better, but because they understood attention. Attention brings fear faster. Fear produces reaction quicker. Reaction draws resources. Resources fuel conflict. Conflict builds profile. Profile attracts recruits. And so the cycle fed itself. Inside the remnants of the old structures, some watched quietly as this transformation unfolded. They recognized the danger immediately. Noise is expensive. Noise attracts alignment. Noise shortens timelines. What takes silence decades to build, noise can dismantle in a season. For communities, this transition felt brutal in a new way. Under silence, danger felt distant but constant. Under noise, Danger felt immediate and random. Entire regions experienced spikes in violence that felt disconnected from any long narrative. The old balance, however brutal, had collapsed, and with it, the illusion of predictability. For younger generations pulled into this world, the lesson changed instantly. They no longer learned patience. They learned display. They no longer learned how to move unseen. They learned how to be recognized. The old skills of invisibility lost status. Visibility became currency, and currency always reshapes ambition. This shift also changed the psychology of downfall. Under the old system, collapse was quiet. Under the new one, collapse is public. Arrests are televised. Convoys are broadcast. Defeats circulate instantly across networks that never forget. This creates a strange acceleration of legend. Fame rises faster than sustainability. And sustainability is what silence once protected. The world entered an era where criminal power no longer tried to disappear and IT tried to dominate the narrative in real time. This made it more frightening to witness, and strangely, more fragile to maintain. The new kings rule loudly. But loud power cannot hide from history the way quiet power once did. IT burns brighter and burns out faster. Chapter 19. Digital Underworld. When crime entered the algorithm. Long after silence gave way to noise, and noise fragmented into 1,000 competing echoes, something quieter than both began to reshape everything. The algorithm, not as a tool, but as environment. For generations, the criminal world had depended on roads, ports, borders, and faces. Then the world learned how to move value without moving bodies. Screens replaced street corners. Encrypted messages replaced whispers. Digital ledgers replaced hand-to-hand exchange. And the underworld did not follow the internet. IT merged with IT. In the age of the digital shadow, the old architecture of the Sinaloa Cartel felt both ancient and prophetic. Ancient, because it had been built on physical corridors and human silence. Prophetic, because its deepest principle, invisibility through structure, translated perfectly into an online world where identity itself could become an illusion. Money was the first to dissolve into data. Cryptographic systems turned value into movement without location. Transactions no longer required banks as intermediaries. Borders became irrelevant to exchange itself. This did not eliminate laundering. IT accelerated it. Now, money could fracture into thousands of microscopic fragments, travel through chains no human could track intuitively, and recombine minutes later as something that no longer resembled its origin. The old world hid money in buildings. The new world hid money in math. Communication followed the same evolution. In the old world, a trusted messenger was a person. In the new world, a trusted messenger was a protocol. Messages existed for seconds, then vanished. Voices became signals. Meetings became metadata. And surveillance began fighting a new kind of invisibility, one that did not depend on darkness, but on volume and speed. Distribution transformed next. Where once narcotics had moved through physical networks alone, now the coordination of that movement lived digitally. Shipping schedules optimized by algorithms, risk calculated by predictive models, corridors selected not by instinct alone, but by machine-driven probability. Human judgment did not disappear. IT was augmented. And augmentation created a new kind of efficiency that no traditional policing framework had been built to confront. Crime had entered the age of scalability without proximity. You no longer needed to control a neighborhood to shape a market. You only needed control over infrastructure that influenced decision-making. AD placement, routing software, payment gateways, logistics management systems. The digital underworld did not replace the physical one. IT sat on top of it, steering it quietly. This altered the psychology of participation completely. The new generation of operators did not grow up memorizing routes. They memorized interfaces. They learned to navigate dashboards instead of highways. They learned to erase fingerprints instead of footprints. They learned that identity itself could be rotated endlessly like currency. The meaning of being known changed. Being known no longer meant being visible. IT meant being indexed somewhere you could never fully leave. For law enforcement, the conflict entered a strange new phase, no longer a chase only across geography, but across server farms, algorithmic decision trees, encrypted ecosystems, machine-generated behavior models. This was not a war of raids, it was a war of computation against computation. And in that war, human reaction times became a liability. One of the most unsettling consequences of the digital underworld was how little it required physical violence. To function, violence still existed, but coordination did not depend on it. Influence moved through search rankings, platform moderation gaps, de-targeting vulnerabilities, network amplification. Control flowed invisibly through attention rather than intimidation alone. Crime learned how to occupy awareness itself. Markets also dissolved into abstraction. Buyers no longer knew sellers. Sellers no longer knew distributors. Each layer became buffered by code, ratings, digital trust systems, and reputation. Algorithms, trust detached from people. It attached to patterns of feedback. This created a chilling efficiency. Betrayal no longer required courage. It required an exploit. Even recruitment changed. Young operators no longer entered the world through kinship or proximity. They entered through online communities that never touched the streets until the streets touched them. Crime became asynchronous. You could be recruited in one country, directed in another, act in a third, and disappear into a fourth, all without ever meeting the system that shaped you. This produced a new paradox of power. The more digitally sophisticated the underworld became, the less emotionally attached its participants felt to any single identity, territory, or organization. Loyalty thinned, opportunity multiplied, and volatility embedded itself into the structure of criminal careers. For the public, this change was invisible. Street violence still made headlines. Arrests still told familiar stories. But beneath those narratives, the real movement increasingly happened in quiet infrastructures no camera could focus on. The digital underworld did not look frightening. It looked like ordinary networks doing ordinary work, which is always the most dangerous disguise. The final transformation is this. Once crime becomes algorithmic, it no longer behaves like a traditional enemy. You cannot wait for it to appear. You must predict where it will statistically emerge. You cannot remove it through one decisive action. You must interfere with probabilities themselves. And interfering with probabilities is far more complex than confronting people. The shadow learned how to become data, and data does not flee. It replicates. Chapter 20. The End of Cartels. When the future no longer wears their names. Every era eventually asks the same question. Not aloud, not directly, but quietly, through patterns that no longer resemble the past. Is this the end, or only the next disguise? For more than a century, the world learned to understand organized crime through names. Empires were defined by banners, territory by surnames, fear by identity. One era belonged to one syndicate. The next era replaced it with another. From the outside, this looked like a cycle. From the inside, it was something far more subtle. A translation of structure into new language. When the age of the old empires faded, including the long dominance of the Sinaloa Cartel, the world waited for the familiar signs of succession. A new name, a new face, a new banner to fear. But something different began to take shape instead. The future did not announce itself with a throne. It emerged as a network without ceremony. The question is no longer, who runs the cartel? The question has become, where does control now reside? And the answer grows harder to localize with every year that passes. Crime today no longer needs a single headquarters. It doesn't need a recognizable godfather. It doesn't need a capital city of shadow. It needs bandwidth, liquidity, data, access, and the right points of friction inside legal systems. The older model of territorial dominance is slowly being replaced by infrastructural dominance. Whoever controls how money moves, how goods move, how information moves, controls more than any gunman ever could. This is why the future is no longer shaped by one cartel at a time. It is shaped by overlapping ecosystems of criminal function. Some specialize in distribution, some in finance, some in data, some in logistics, some in influence. They do not always know each other. They do not need to. They interact through interfaces rather than loyalty. The old world of crime depended on lineage. The new world depends on interoperability. To the public, this creates an illusion that cartels are everywhere. In truth, the opposite is happening. Cartels as centralized empires are becoming less necessary. Crime no longer needs kingdoms. It needs platforms. What once required a massive organization can now be coordinated by small, anonymous cells plugged into global systems. Where once a supply chain required hundreds of loyal humans, now it may require a handful of skilled operators. A set of automated tools. A network of interchangeable contractors, and a few weak links inside legitimate infrastructure. This makes the future quieter in some places and more chaotic in others. Violence will not disappear, but it will become less ceremonial, less symbolic, more transactional, more sudden, more detached from legacy. Violence will no longer signal the rise of empires. It will signal competition between invisible functions. Governments already sense this shift. They no longer ask only, "Where is the kingpin?" They ask, "Where is the server? Where is the payment gateway? Where is the algorithm being manipulated? Where is the regulatory blind spot?" This is not a war that ends with capture. It is a war that mutates with technology. One of the most unsettling truths is that the future of organized crime may no longer feel like organized crime at all. It may feel like market fluctuations, logistics disruptions, supply chain shortages, unexpected real estate booms, cryptic investment anomalies. Crime will increasingly resemble economic weather rather than criminal conspiracy, and weather is far harder to arrest for communities raised under the era of visible cartel dominance. This shift creates emotional confusion. People once feared names. Soon, they may fear systems they can't point to at all. The danger becomes less personal and more ambient. Even memory begins to change shape. The legends of the old cartels will one day feel cinematic, defined, contained. Their stories will feel like chapters that had beginnings and endings. But the future will not offer that clarity. The future will feel like permanent motion without narrative resolution. The final transformation of all may be this. The age of cartels as identities may be ending, but the age of cartel methods is only accelerating. Smuggling, influence, economic distortion, shadow logistics, political corrosion, digital concealment. These skills have outgrown the banners they once flew under. Is this the end of cartels in the way the world once understood them? Yes, that it may be. But in the deeper sense, the structures that made cartels inevitable have not disappeared. They have simply learned how to exist without being named. The future will not be ruled by one shadow. It will be shaped by many overlapping ones, none large enough to fully see, yet powerful enough to bend outcomes quietly in every direction. And this is the most unsettling ending of all. Not collapse, not victory, not silence, but a world where the shadow no longer needs a face because it has learned how to become the system itself. And so the story fades back into silence, not with answers, not with closure, but with the uneasy understanding that power rarely disappears. It only changes its shape. Names may vanish from headlines. Faces may fade from memory. But the forces that move beneath this world continue to breathe in quieter places. In shadows that rarely announce themselves. Tonight's story was not just about crime. It was about patience, about systems built in silence, about how ambition learns to hide inside routine. And as you rest now, remember this. The loudest dangers are rarely the most powerful. It is the quiet ones that last the longest. If you're still here with me, thank you for listening. Thank you for spending your night inside these shadows. If you haven't yet, subscribe to True Crime Records for a new story every night. Drop a comment and tell me what country you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Until next time, let the world fall quiet and let the shadows speak again. Good night.